All right, so I'll get started then. First, thank you very much for this wonderful conference. It's amazing. I feel extremely just really privileged to be with this wonderful group of people. I just really need to acknowledge that. Okay, so the chapter that I have been assigned with Sonia, Ke, I thought I would talk a little bit about the title first. See if I can make this work. You're not working? Do I point it that way? Oh, it has to be. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Okay, I thought I'd talk a bit about the title and a little bit about its reputation and also the structure of it. It's very short, so it all fits on one slide. First of all, these are some options for the title. Finicky notions, graven intentions, ingrained ideas, honing the will. That's after Guo Xiang's kind of or I guess Sima Biao's, this to carve is to cut away. It means something like Junqi, to make one's intentions like steep, like a pinnacle, to put it on a pedestal maybe. I don't know. It's it was a little bit tricky to translate Junqi. But I think that's where Lin is getting that translation maybe. So the title is taken from the first line, and therefore I think we have to think that it's not a good thing. The first line is saying, you know, 刻意 上行 li shi yi su. So it's like they, you know, make their intentions like ingrained or graven or something. I like Brooks Graven actually, because it's after biblical like graven images or something. So it's something that's kind of more stiff than it should be. And later in the chapter, we find 可以 again, 不可以而高. So you can be lofty without this 可以. So without, and that sort of goes with Sima Biao's interpretation, I think, to make them steep, to make them like chiseled down, maybe even. I vaguely toyed, until I got that far, I vaguely toyed with the idea that maybe these are replacement 可以, like, because the rest of the chapter has a little bit of a proverbial, like it's got a feeling like it's a bunch of platitudes, that's the right word. There's a bunch of platitudes, like Taoist platitudes almost, that you should like believe. And so those are almost, to me, they also feel a little bit like 可以, but clearly not in this text's vocabulary. Other uses of 可 in the text I just kind of looked at just out of curiosity. But then this one was interesting because of where it is. It's, you know, the TND, it carves the myriad, the sort of all the forms without being clever or something. The whole phrase is repeated in Da Zongshi and Tiandao. And that's like one of the few other uses of carve in the entire text. The only other one is how Bulla treats horses. So that will like kind of be interesting later, because I think this chapter has a pretty considerable resemblance, or sort of some kind of relationship with Da Zongshi and Tiandao. On to like the evaluations. These are my kind of crude paraphrases rather than translations. Luo Miandao, Kui, and Shanxing are crap, probably forgeries. Wang Fuzhi. This chapter continues the argument of chapter 3, Yang Shengzhu and Da Zongshi, but compared to them, it's grimacing an imitation of Xi. So it's like, also thinks it's crap. Yao Nai, this is the same type of writing as Sima Tan's Six Schools essay, probably comes from the Han, he says, which I'll take that. I'll take that one up in a little bit. I also, before I even read Yao Nai's comment, I definitely noticed that resemblance as well. And Wang Shumin, this chapter discusses nourishing the Shen, so he's like a little bit more. and although the writing isn't great, first part is sort of Zhuangzi, and again, paraphrase, surely not from his hand, but heaps of early texts quoted this chapter, And so he says it probably predates the Han because it's just so widely quoted. It kind of interesting conclusion. We've been talking about this kind of fluid textual culture, so it's unclear whether this chapter as it existed, but it does seem like there are very old bits in it. Whether its structure was the same, I don't know. So in terms of structural divisions, the whole chapter is only 658 characters, I think, if I've counted correctly. So it's really not long. Here it is. I think it falls into 3 parts. Now I feel worried about calling them pericopes, so maybe I won't. But it has like 3 major parts. I think Chris Fraser also divided into 3, but maybe put the division in a slightly different place from his chart, I think. The first one is, I would say, like there's a distinct part that talks about 5 types of people who fall short, and the 6th type who's a paragon. So it's a kind of 6-part survey type structure. You can tell that by grammatical parallelism, which I'll show in a second. Then there's a part which I think of like the SAGE's skill set, or KPIs, key performance indicators. I don't know if that's an Australian terminology, but like it feels like this is what the SAGE has got to, kind of be like to be a SAGE. And this part is kind of brought together, made coherent by this repeated use of gu yue. It's a bit strange, but it's very, very distinctive. And then this kind of metrical language, so it's like it's got couplets. They're 4-character, 4-character, or 6-character. So it's got this kind of metered, poetic kind of feel to it. Often parallel couplets that are antithetical, so like opposites. And there are other kind of highly structured bits in here, so like enumerated list, or kind of list of like parallel things. And then there's this relatively less structured part at the end. I'm not exactly sure where the 2-3 line is, but I feel like the end is sort of focused around this parable, or this kind of analogy with swords in a box. And then there's also a proverb. And so that bit has less structure and feels like a different part of the text. So that's my kind of hypothesis. Of course, you don't have to read it from here, but this is the entire text on one slide, as I said. It's surprisingly big. It's bigger than I would have thought. But you can see the red in the left part is the grammatical parallelism, way something re, so they only do this, 吃, and then something, some type of person, 只说好也. So they only do this, and then these are that type of person's fondness, is what they're kind of caught up with. And there are 5 of those, and then the last one is different, right? The last one breaks the pattern, but it's clearly this. You can see that there's a little bit of the pattern at the end, again, but it's more complete, right? And I'm going to leave that part mainly. I'll talk a little bit about its intertextuality, but Sonya's going to talk about it a bit more. And so I will leave the content of it to her. The second section has this gu yue, which I've marked in blue. And then the green bits are these antithetical couplets or pairings. So, and you can see how like they're concentrated in the middle section of part 2, and there are a lot of them, right? But they don't, as far as I can tell, they don't really appear in the earlier part and the later part. Maybe I'm being a little bit biased in what I consider opposites, but we could sort of talk about this. And then the gray bits are these kind of motifs that I think is like the passage is centered around a certain motif, like the swords in the box, the proverb, or like the metaphor of water in the end of 2. So that's maybe why that part should be in the 3rd. I don't know. Okay, so that's my kind of tentative. This is when I was reading it. This is how I structured it in terms of how I understood the different parts of it. Do they hang together? Sort of. They do sort of hang together. I think if they hang together, Wang Shumin is right that it's all talking about how you cultivate your shen, your whatever. And I would really like to know how we're going to translate that. Graham uses daemon, which I do not like at all. Spirit is the general translation, not so great either. There's like maybe some god inside you. I don't know, some divinity or something. But that's one thing that I would love to hear from you guys about. I did a little bit of work on the intertextuality with this, just because it does seem to have a lot of connections. I will merely sort of skim by my Huainanzi slides since basically Tobias talked about everything I was going to talk about. So, this is the kind of Huainanzi parallels by Huainanzi chapter. Some of these are very imperfect because Huainanzi quotes the same line in more than one chapter, and I didn't quite know how to make my colors do that. It was going to be very visually messy. But it's roughly sort of looking like that, with gray is the Jingshan chapter, which is the kind of biggest, I think, parallel. But it does have an interesting relationship with Huainanzi, whatever that relationship is. The kind of intertextuality that was very, very striking to me when I was first looking at it was the extreme similarity between this list, which I guess I'd call a critical survey of types, and it's not a discourse. I would not call it a discourse so much as I would call it a genre. Like, I think it's a thing that people do at different times, because although Yao Nai says, oh, it's like Sima Tan's thing, so it's from the Han, actually there are other people who do it. This is the Sima Tan one, Liu Zhao Zhi Yao Zhi, right? So this is, whether you know it or not, this is very influential. This essay will be very influential on your picture of what warring states thought looked like. It basically set the categories for warring states thought for a long time through Chinese tradition, right? So why do we have legalists and Taoists and, Ru and Mo and sophists or logicians, whatever we call them, because Sima Tan described them in this critical survey. And so everyone took that to be, oh yeah, that must have been what the warring states was like. And sort of later, with excavated texts, we've kind of brought in the picture a little bit, but this was a very influential essay. One of the curious things that I never knew about Ke, having never properly read the chapter, is that it's so similar to the Sima Tan essay is longer and it goes through everything twice. But there's a great similarity in just the way they treat these things, different categories. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about all of these that I've looked at is that it's like according to the time. But there are some similarities. Oops, my arrows got wrong. So the Ru and the Ru cultivators are similar. So the twos are similar, and the maybe the Fajia and the court functionaries are similar. So sorry, the arrows aren't quite where they should be. But I think there's a little bit of similarity in category, but it's definitely not a perfect overlap. So why do I think they're related? Well, partly because they're also textual parallels. So Sima Tan maybe in some sense quotes this chapter or quotes something like it. And this is the best one. It looks short, but it's meaning-wise very similar. And so this is again, I'm skipping the first part. I'll let Sonia do it. This is sort of beginning of the second part of Ke, where it basically says, if you're, it's the burnout, I call it the burnout discourse. If your body is exhausted and you do not rest, then you become worn out. If your jing, your essence is used too much, overused, and you don't stop doing that, then you become tired, exhausted. Or if you become tired, and if you're tired, then you become exhausted. You get completely drained. You get worn out. And I think all of us have experienced this. So the burnout discourse is very relevant for today's world. And then that's the Ke version. In Sima Tan, he gives a kind of abbreviated version, but I think it's quite recognizable. Now, if your shen, your spirit, is greatly used, used a great deal, overused, then you will be drained. It will be drained. And if it's greatly tired, then it will get worn out. Right? So the vocabulary is all the same. The grammar is a little bit the same, and some of the terms are switched around a little bit. But I think it's fairly clear that that's textually related. I think we can debate it. Is it quoting from Ke or a common source text? Again, we can talk about that. In Sima Tan's case, I don't know. But I think for others, there's a clearer answer. Here's another one. This one's less clear just because the language is more conventional. But again, Sima Ten says, Dao Jia causes people, the Dao school, the Dao lineage. I now use lineage. Is that your preferred for Jia, maybe? I don't know. I think Mark is the expert on how to translate Jia. The Dao Jia. Causes people's concentrated spirit, so their like essence and spirit to be sort of focused and unified, or focused in one, or something like that. And their motions become united with the formless. So that's what Sima Tan says. Here it says only, this, I sort of hesitate to translate this even because we really struggled to translate this. I read this with graduate students, with Tony among others, and I think we got to this and there, like 5 people in the room had 5 different, even grammatical analyses of some of these lines. So, but it's something like your heart is defended, and is like protected and not lose it. Your spirit is protected and don't lose it. And then you with your spirit are one, and being one, your essence can penetrate. That's the line that we were all kind of, or your unified essence. It was that was the line that's tricky. So maybe I can hear from you what you think it means, and become one with the heavenly regulation. I think Dao is used instead in Huainan's version. But the point that I wanted to make about that, without awkwardly translating it, is that there's a little bit of this sense of Jing and Shen, use of Jing and Shen, and oneness and He, and maybe that's just conventional, or maybe not. But given that the other one is pretty clearly related, I think there's some kind of textual relationship. All right. Just quickly through some other critical survey of types genre, just because I think it's kind of interesting. The Tianxia chapter in Zhuangzi also has one of these. And structurally speaking, it's also 6, which I think is interesting. Like the sixity is a feature of this genre. We have Mozi, Songxing and Yinwan. So Mozi's sort of good-hearted ascetics, Songxing and Yinwan, martyrs to humility, Peng Meng Tianpian Shen Dao, assholes of impartiality, Guanyin and Laodan, just the best. They're the kind of approved ones in this list, so they don't come last. Zhuangzi, crazy but mostly harmless, and Huishi, like lots of paradoxes, is kind of my take on the Tianxia one. If I'm counting correctly, I think there are 6. I could be wrong about that. But just to note, that's a very different list. So that's not the same list that we have in Keyi, right? And I think one of my kind of thoughts about these survey of genres is like, this is like survey, like state of the field kind of like motion here, this genre. And so I think it really is going to be very sensitive to the intellectual context in which it's produced. And that's what makes that genre interesting, because it's like going to give you a sense of maybe whoever's writing that at that moment, those are the people they think are relevant for their purpose. Like a state of the field, they're kind of useful, even if not always the most interesting. Earliest one maybe, Shunzi Jiebi. Also quite different, but clearly pre-Han. 6, Mozi, Songzi, Shenzi, Shunzi, Huizi, and Zhuangzi, famously Zhuangzi Biyu Tian Er Bu Zhi Ren. Zhuangzi is blinded by heaven and doesn't know the human. But it's clearly another one of these. Again, a different type of list. And this is more contentious. I think this might be one of them in Tian Dao. This is a passage we talked about considerably, like a great deal yesterday, the one about the mo, the like ending things. But again, it is not talking about types of people here. It's talking about different like functions of government maybe. But still, you imagine different types of people are doing these different functions by and large. And so you have troops rewarding and punishing, like something like designations and ritual, something like musical instruments. The space that I had for English there was small, so I had to abbreviate a little bit. And mourning as like different functions. And then the reason I kind of want to put it in this category is it says the sixth one, so like with Ke, the sixth is to make a motion where you can have all of these things, right? These 5 are the sort of ends, as we talked about yesterday, but you need to kind of attend to the beginning. And the Ke chapter has that. In 6 is like you can have all 5 of these things if you do your Shen cultivation right. All right, so that's my kind of survey of genres. Oh yeah, and like maybe there's an overlap. The core functionaries look a little bit like, not those, but like the designations one, but it's not very clear. There's not much overlap at all, I think would be my point about those. All right. We'll go on to talk about, this is the kind of main point I want to make, which is about not intertextuality, but I guess maybe intratextuality if we take the Zhuangzi as a text, what Liu Xiaogang calls inner links. And the biggest one here is with Tian Dao. Even to the extent that A.C. Graham says in his little translation of it, after declaring that all 5 can fulfill their aims by following the comprehensive way of heaven and earth, that's the first part of Ke, the writer proceeds to an exposition, much of it in the same words as in the way of heaven. And I kind of quoted that on purpose because I think the wording there is careful, right? I don't think in Tian Dao, I don't think he translates Tian Dao, but he doesn't say in Tian Dao it uses the same words as Ke, but he doesn't say it's quoting from Tian Dao either, right? The other interesting thing about this quote is it says much of it. So I was like, how much of it? Like, does it show up? It doesn't show up too well. I'll go through it more carefully. But, the red and blue bits are the overlaps. So it's all in this kind of top part of the second section, and it's all kind of, there's not heaps of it, but it feels like a lot when you're reading it for sure, right? Let's see. But the other point I want to make, so these are direct verbal parallels. Like some of them are verbatim. Some of them are near enough verbatim that it's pretty uncontroversial that they're related. But the other point I want to make is this survey of genres bit in the left, so the thing I've shaded in pink, that's the whole sort of critical survey genre. That kind of overlaps in the sense that there's also one in Tian Dao. And then there's also a water metaphor. It's not the same water metaphor, but it's kind of related in some way. And maybe just water metaphors are really common. But again, because there's already a relationship, I became suspicious, maybe overly suspicious. But just to look at that water metaphor for a second, maybe to see the similarities, maybe to see the differences. So now this slide is Tian Dao on this side and Ke on this side. Of course, this is not all of Tian Dao. It's just the very first bit. So it's the very beginning part, if you wanted to follow it in the Tian Dao side. And this part is the middle part of Ke. The gray is the water metaphor. And I'll actually, if I can ever get this in the right direction. So I'll give you the 2 of them in large so you can actually read it. In Tian Dao, did we read the water metaphor? I can't remember. It's really interesting, though. We read part of it, I think. When water is calm, then it can reflect like a candle or your fine hairs. So it's like it can reflect even really refined details. And when it's flat, it's so flat that a carpenter can use it as a model. Right, a great carpenter. And then water's quietness is so bright, so reflective. And it's like merely water, I think is the sense, much less that of the concentrated spirit. So mere water can be this bright, this reflective. So, your concentrated or essence and spirit or whatever it is can even more so be. So when the sage's heart is still, then it's a mirror for heaven and earth, or another kind of mirror for the myriad things. And maybe Tian Dao specialists can correct me on this translation. But this kind of mirror imagery is very, very striking in Tiandao, not at all in Keyi, right? It doesn't exist in Keyi. The Keyi point is very different. So in the Keyi, it's the nature of water. It's the nature of water that when it's buza or qing, it's unmixed, then it's clear. Mo dong zi ping, when it's not like made to move, then it's flat or still. So flat. But then it says, if you kind of block it up and it can't flow, then it also won't be qing. So it needs to like somehow flow in order to be qing. So it's like thinking, like this person is clearly thinking very hard about water, like what's water like, and you don't get stirred up with mud, but and in like winds, there's like no wind or no like waterfalls, and it's going to be flat and clear, but stagnant water is also quite gross. And like that's being kind of employed there. And 天德之象, that's an image of tian's, of heaven's de power or something. And so that's why I say this kind of, if it's pure and essential and not mixed, and the jing is it's quiet and one and doesn't change. Now that our bubian, I stumbled over that. Is that supposed to be good? I suppose it's supposed to be good. Maybe it's in its quietness and oneness, it doesn't change. It's bland and does uwe and uwe. I'm going to say does uwe. And then I can't read it because I can read it turn this way. Then and yes, when it in motion, it kind of it is like heaven's motion, right? And this actually echoes an earlier thing that I won't kind of get into, but the sage also. Sorry, you're sitting like right in front of it. So in motion, it sort of uses heaven's way of moving. This is the way of cultivating the shen, the spirit. So you want to kind of, in cultivating your shen, these are the things, these are the KPIs. Onward. So just to compare these two passages for a second, they're similar in having water, they're similar in having flatness, quietness, and in using them as a metaphor for shen. They're dissimilar, though, in just like the way they use the water metaphor. So I don't know if it's just like water is this, everyone uses water, but it seems like they have some similarities. So that's just kind of my point about that. Now, in terms of the closer parallels, and I'm just kind of showing you, I mean, these highlights are to show you kind of where in the, show you where in the text they are. I'm going backwards, aren't I? It like actually says up and down, but I just can't read that at the moment. So this is the closer parallels, and a little bit bigger, not much bigger, but I'll go through this a little bit, not quite so painfully as this. But you have in Keyi, I'll just read the Keyi version, you can kind of look at the Tiandao version. Now, being bland and sort of still, empty, wu wei, these sort of four terms. And in the Tiandao version, you have the same terms, but like with a different phrasing. It's like almost parsed differently. So it's a verbatim parallel, but it's like a little bit, clearly they like it's being understood differently. And then this is heaven and earth, like the piece of heaven and earth, and the substance of Daoda, the zhi of Daoda. In Tiandao, it has this exact same line, except it's the perfection of Daoda. So it's like maybe a homophone character, or like a variant with a different meaning, though, clearly different meaning. And then this is the sort of burnout discourse, right? So thus I say the sage rests. So all of you take note. If you rest, then you can be at ease. At being at ease, then you can be bland. The interesting part is that Tiandao won't go through it, but it takes it in a completely different direction, right? The sage rests. There's a little bit of difference, again, seems like a parsing difference or punctuation difference in how the line is being parsed, but then rests in it, maybe, xiu yan, and it's being used as an end there. And then xiu zi xu, xu zi shi, shi zhi lun ye, and I think that's a interpolated gloss. Xu zi jing, jing zi dong. Jing zi dong. If it's still, then it's in motion. Anyway, like it's sort of a long chain, long complex chain. So I call this a divergence because like you start with the same and then you diverge to different directions, right? You sort of start with one text and go in different directions with it. Then what's interesting, it reconverges briefly. So, suddenly sort of it comes back. You huan bu neng chu. And in the Kuyi, it says you huan bu neng ru. So it's like anxiety can't get in, or anxiety has no place there. And then it just goes off in its direction again, right? So I don't quite know what to make of this, but it seems quite interesting, right? And I'll come back to it a little bit. I'm going to go through a few more of these. Now, next, what happens in Tiandao is another critical survey, except it's not so critical. It's another 6-part thing where it says, once you've done that good stuff, each of these sort of 6 people do it, or 6 types of people do it, and they get this good result. So it's still 6, but not so critical, like it's good stuff. And I'll skip, that has no parallel in Kuyi, but it's just, I thought it was interesting. Then kind of moving on to the next passage of Tiandao, then we have the Zhuangzi Zhuangzi Ye Wu Shi Hu quote from Da Zongshi. Again, not so much in Kuyi, that quote isn't, but it says, Gu Yue, and then I start to wonder, like, who is doing that Yue? In Da Zongshi, this, the next part is not part of the quote, but it's always punctuated in Tiandao as if it were. So don't know, maybe it's not. I don't know how you guys like the punctuation. But then there's a close parallel. Let's see, so which part is it? Yeah, good. So in the Kuyi version, it's so close that I won't do the other one. Just the difference is that in Tiandao, it's 知天乐者. I'll call that the heavenly music, the one who knows the heavenly music, I guess. Now I've been taught to do so. And in Kuyi, it's the sage. So the shengren zhi sheng ye tianxing. His life is like, as far as life, it's like the motion of heaven. His death is like the transformation of things, or his death is the transformation of things. And this is all parallel. In rest, he has the same power as yin, and in motion, he has the same what as yang. Bo, waves, resonance. We were like playing with this. I forget what Brooke does with it, but it's like, what's bo meant to be? Like one person in my reading group suggested maybe it's like the way wind, because I'm thinking like bo is watery. How is that yang? But like wind over water makes waves, right? So maybe it's like the wind that he does, like he's the dong, he's the motion that can make waves, because he's like on the top. I don't know. That one's I have no idea, but it's in both. I think it's in both. And then this is a little tricky, but I do take this as an antithetical parallel as well. He does not, for the sake of good fortune, go first. So even if it would be like very lucky for him to go first, or very like it would be a good thing for him to go first, he doesn't do it. And he does not, because of catastrophe, start anything. And then he only like, he's first stimulated and only then does he respond. Has to be pressed and only then does he move. So he's like coerced he's pushed into moving. And he only kind of gets up and like starts doing things when he has no other choice. So he does do these things, it's just only when he has to. getting rid of knowledge and tradition or the old stuff. And then he kind of gets to or sort of investigates the patterns of heaven. I wonder, this is really speculative, but I feel like this might be different from the burnout section. You know, the bit where the sages need rest, don't use it all up. This is terrible if you don't get rest. But death is okay. So does that mean that burnout is a fate worse than death? Like maybe it is, but it's a very strange, when you read them together, it feels a little strange. Like death is fine, but don't use it up. Just as my random burnt out thoughts. A little bit more parallel. So there's a kind of lack of, there's like a little bit that's in Kyuyi and not in Tiandao, but then Tiandao, the parallel continues. So you know that either the one who knows heavenly music or something, or the sage probably here is the subject still, doesn't have heaven's either resentment or disasters. There's a pretty big difference. Well, maybe not a big difference actually, because when heaven resents you, it sends disasters. Then this is parallel but reversed. So it's doesn't have the burden of things, doesn't get denounced by humans, and isn't blamed by ghosts in Kuyi. In Tiandao, the two middle ones are reversed. And we could sort of, I don't know, is there meaning in that? I feel like the hierarchy of Tian, Ren, Wu, and Gui is better. So it's more like a natural hierarchy. So if you have the Tiandao version feels like it's in the right order, and the Kuyi version feels like it's a bit in the strange order. But that's just kind of a vague feeling. But if that's the case, that would kind of militate again. That would make Kuyi the earlier one, I think, because it's a little bit lectio difficilio, right? It's a little bit harder to figure out. Like you think you'd fix the Kuyi one to turn it into the Tiandao one. And then sort of famous lines quoted by Jia Yi. This is the only part of Kuyi that I knew before this workshop. 其生若夫，其死若休. His death is like, or his life is like floating, and its death like a rest. And again, feels like a different piece of text from the one that says the sage always rests, because if it's only in death that he rests, then why is he like resting before too? Like, you know, or is just death continuous with what he does, which is a bit of an odd conclusion too. So I just feel like the death motif and the resting motif fit strangely here. And then he doesn't consider, he's like doesn't worry about stuff, maybe past stuff. He doesn't plan about future stuff. Again, I take that to be antithetical. Shines but doesn't sparkle, is trustworthy but doesn't. We couldn't quite agree on what it meant. He doesn't hope other people to be trustworthy, or he's not predictable. I think those are the two kind of readings for Qi. Maybe other people have other ones. His sleep, in sleep he doesn't dream, and in waking he doesn't wake up worried. Unlike me, clearly I'm not a sage. That last bit is from Da Zongshi. So again, it's a quote or a parallel overlap. So a little bit more, again, so you can see so I'm going through basically all the parallel bits just because I think it's interesting. Just a little bit more of it here. That's mostly what I've shown you before. But just in the kind of form that turned out to be quite distracting. Okay. The last little parallel after that quote is his spirit is pure and concentrated. So his shen is pure and concentrated. His hun is not worn out. And in Tiandao, you get his ghost is not evil or dangerous or something. So it's a little bit different. Qi Shen is very different from Qi Gui. I forget how to read that word, but he's like his ghost is not like scary, evil. But the one with Qi Hun is quite similar. Qi Hun Bu Pi, same reading. My dictionary says it's a Tongjie. It's a lone character. So those two are the same meaning. This is like one doesn't get worn out. Sorry, downward. So enough of this intertextuality bit, but just to say, it's a wearying amount of intertextuality. I feel burnt out just having made all those slides. But what can we conclude? So Tiandao and Keyi, they have these verbatim or near verbatim parallels, quite a few of them, but with slightly different phrasing choices. So, we read punctuated texts, but they were not reading punctuated texts, right? So it's almost like someone's like trying to punctuate the text and they do it differently, right? There are also homophone and synonym variations, which might imply that those characters, like the homophone ones, maybe they were the same character and they diverged differently afterwards. Some of these sections, they're not verbatim parallels, but they do share the same motifs, like the critical survey motif or the use of water to talk about Shen. And some of them are like, so I guess I would feel like my working hypothesis about these two texts and their relationship is that they're different elaborations on the same source material. So like there's some source material that's shorter and different, and both of these chapters have it or have got hold of it, and they're like doing different things with it. But the fact that so many of these different kind of discourses or different themes are still showing up parallel in these two chapters suggests to me that like there's one, like maybe it's like one body of source material that's like either heterogeneous. In both you have Keyi more than Tiandao, but in both you have these kind of quotative gestures, 故曰, and originally in a reading group, we're like, maybe it's like, I reckon, like, that's why I say, or something like that. But maybe it says. Maybe it's quoting, like, actually explicitly quoting something, and we don't, like, it was like obvious to them what it was, but not to us. And then the other thing that comes out is that it seems like there's a bit of a relationship with Dazhongshi. It may be a source for some of the material, certainly not the source. Like, it's not like everything in here is harking back to that. There's a lot of other stuff in there. But like maybe there's a little constellation and Dazhongshi is in that constellation. And just in terms of I was being a bit too loud there. I shouldn't be anywhere near a microphone. I'm so loud by myself. Just in terms of this inner links in a more general way. So the idea of kind of quote and then elaboration, Tobias's presentation showed this structure with Huainanzi, right? Huainanzi quote Zhuangzi, then some like commentary, what he calls like internal commentary or something, another Zhuangzi quote, and then more commentary. And I think you actually get a little bit of that structure in these intertextual parallels that I showed, right? And furthermore, many of the long parallels, intratextual parallels in Zhuangzi have that structure as well, but not all of them. So this is a list of the longest parallels within the Zhuangzi, the longest interlinks. One between 19 and 20, that's a 19. So the gram like structure is like there are 19 characters that are verbatim the same. The caged bird story, again 8 grams, but it's really 54 because it's just like there's a little bit of difference in the middle. I did this with quantitative methods, so the computer is a little dumber. But if you go like read it, you can sort of count 54 parallel. And then the most interesting one, like my actually favorite of this, I really want to write a paper on this, is the parallel between chapter 2 and chapter 23. There's a 24-gram overlap. 24 characters are identical. And it's the understanding of the ancients one. 23 takes that same beginning and goes off in a different direction with it. Just like uses it differently, which is also weird. And then like a few other ones, the 5 is the one that I just talked about, the process of life and death, I called it then. This is from a previous talk. And then my teacher overlap is a 15-gram. Again, showed that on there. So those are some of the longest ones. And I think there's like something kind of interesting that we could probably learn from these. And I particularly like the ones where, there's some line and then they just really diverge and different chapters diverge in how they use it. this part, I'm not going to talk about too much. I was like, okay, I've done all this philology. Let me like try to do some philosophy on it. And like this chapter is so short that my attempt to do philosophy is like kind of exactly what Sonia ended up doing. So I won't repeat. She has a different take, and I'll let her do it. But I take the main message of this chapter to be: don't burn yourself out. I don't have to say any more about that. I think it's like clear. So that's, if you're going to take about OA one thing, don't get burned out. Rest. Burnout is a fate worse than death. The other one is a sort of thing about Wu Wei, which I'll skip because I think I'll let Sonia kind of do it her way. But then the third one, it ends with this metaphor of swords in a box. And it's a little tricky what to know what to do with this metaphor, and is kind of related with the way the Wu Wei stuff is working out probably. But he says when you have a precious sword, you keep it hidden in a box and don't use it, because it's like that precious. But then with your spirit flies everywhere, and that's great. Like, it's clear in the text that that's great. Like, this is a paraphrase, obviously, not a translation. So how does the thing relate? I don't know, but I was like confused about it. So then I was like, well, what is this about hiding in a box? Is it good to hide in a box? Was it not good to hide in a box? Like, what about hiding in boxes? So of course I make the sinologist gesture to like, let me go look at some other places where hide in a box is used. So there's this parallel in Huainanzi. This is a fairly close parallel. It's not swords though, it's a piece of jade that you hide in a box because it's bao zhuzhi, it's like because it's an extreme value. And you know, and then it compares it with Jingshen. So, but there Jingshen, I think you're supposed to hide it in the box. Lunyu, I have a piece of jade, should I hide it in a box? Or should I sell it? Says Zhugong says, sell it. Memorably. But this one, my favorite one from Li Ji. Zhuangzi 1 chapter. Kongzi says, I asked of Lao Dan, when the Tianzi dies, when the emperor, when the Son of Heaven dies, or the Lord of Estate dies, the invocator, the like sacrificial official, takes all the tablets from the temple and put them in the ancestral temple. So like all the tablets come and they get stored, and then maybe this is not really relevant because it's not really stored in a box, but because, and that's the Li. So Lao Dan tells him what the Li is. The funerary Li, which is weird. And like sort of goes on and talks about how you do this. And then it even has an end quote at the end. It says, Lao Dan said this, which made me think like, oh, these stories about Kongzi and Lao Dan, this is a different Lao Dan. Like, this feels like a different Lao Dan. You know, it's like another guy whose name happens to be Lao Dan. Maybe you guys, like, who know Li Ji better than I do, have some, like, theory about this passage. But it just feels like there's a guy named Lao Dan who works in the, who's like a, you know, he's not our Lao Dan. But that was my feeling. But anyway, that may be a kind of accidental finding, except for that because it's the ancestral, like, tablets and stuff that are coming, it's sort of related to ghosts and spirits and things. So I was just like, oh, it's like maybe there's something suggestive in that story as well. I don't know. So that's pretty much the sort of random end of that. I've gone through most of it, trying to leave some bits too. Yeah, so that's about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Esther. A great talk. The Tiandao parallels are really interesting to me as well, and what really jumped out to me. I've been thinking about it all morning, and I think I've kind of come to the same conclusion that you have, if I understood correctly. But I wonder if I could share my screen for a second. I just have my own version of what you just did, just formatted somewhat differently. Okay, so if you look, when you're first reading Kei, it does seem like it's almost quoting Tiandao directly, because right here's what you have in Tiandao here, just state it outright, and then in Kei you have Gu Yue, and then the same thing, And then the next guyue, which has, duplicates this part of it. I'm having trouble controlling this cursor, but. And then interestingly is the next time you get it, why is this so hard to control? Yeah, right. Okay, sorry. And here with the 故曰圣人之生也天行怎么样. Interestingly, it also has 故曰 in 天道. So now it no longer seems, it sounds like they're quoting from a third text. And then you get other parallels that where both texts.
Wait, can I stop you for a second? You have 故曰 in 天道, and so what was your conclusion from that?
Well, I mean, they're both quoting from something else.
They're both quoting from something
right?
else, yeah. Okay.
And then you have these other ones where, these parallels over here in the blue and the orange where there's no 故曰 in either text, really. And so, just thinking about that, it just, especially given the fact that the overall philosophical import of 刻意 and the opening sections of 天道 are so different overall, it does really seem like they're both quoting from some third canonical text that's now lost to us, or something something like that.
Yeah, they don't feel like they need to say what it is that says. So they say 故曰, and it doesn't say 故 something yuan.
Right.
Right. They're just like, oh, you would know this.
Right. And then sometimes they feel free to kind of paraphrase. Other times, quote it directly. And yeah, it's really interesting though. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there to kind of.
You've been there. You've gone there too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like one of the passages, I kind of skimmed over it, but one of the passages that's in 天道 that's not in 刻意, it takes the thing in a government direction. So it's just like, oh yeah, and that's why the sage is able to govern the world and like take care of the 10,000 things, right? Yeah. And 刻意 does not take it in that direction. There's no politics in 刻意. It's much more individual.
It'd be interesting to look at all the sections that are quoted or that are actually repeated, let's say, in between the two texts, and see if there's any like rhyme scheme or other sorts of patterns going on. I don't really see the rhyme per se, so maybe it's not there at all, but.
Well, there's metrical, so most of the overlaps are in what I call the like antithetical parallel poetic section. Mm-hmm. So it's not so much rhyme as it is meter.
But it's, right.
But it is a meter.
Yeah.
And like that whole section of 刻意 is like, because I don't read it like that. I read it with line breaks, like poems. So like with line breaks, you can see them really clearly line up. There's 3, 3, 3, 3, and 4, 4.
And it'd be interesting to look see if like the reduplicated sections have a particular pattern that the other sections don't.
That other sections don't. Yeah.
Anyway, thanks.
So I just want to pick up on what Scott said. I think that what struck me also in 天道 is that the section with the Zhuangzi quotation there, it has a lot of 故曰 indeed. I don't think necessarily they're quoting from the 刻意 and 天道, do not necessarily quoting from a single third text, a bit different ones.
Okay.
The way I always read this part of the 天道 chapter is that after having introduced this kind of 虚静无为, this kind of values you're supposed to cultivate, it just collects all kinds of direct and indirect support that they can find to talk about the benefits of doing so. It's a kind of rhetorical thing, and they're just probably things that are around at that time, and maybe that explains why there's an overlap with, an apparent overlap with 刻意, but I agree it's probably not directly quoted from 天道.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that, and like I thought about that too, except it feels like they're sort of almost there's quoted in the same order as well. So like it's not like it's scattered. Like I have a pile of slips and you have a pile of slips, and like some of our piles of slips like have the same text in them. It's more like there's like a little bit of an order that it follows. Then, it's not perfect. It's not perfect.
Then that would make more sense maybe as still based on 天道. I have a number of things that I noted, but maybe I just say one for a time being. So the water metaphor. I think the water metaphor appears once more in 德充府 in the first section, the Wu Zhi Wang Tai section, where he attracts as many people as Kongzi, and then they have the disciple of Kongzi asking, but how is that possible? And then you have this explanation. And there you also have the water metaphor appearing in a way that I think is closer to Tianda. Because in both De Chongfu and Tianda, the water is connected with Ping. In De Chongfu also with Qing, I think. But then it's connected with mirroring.
The mirror motif is really
and
striking,
the mirror metaphor works in a way that other people will see the reflection in there, and so they will naturally come to where they see the reflection, and you can attract people. And I think that is very explicit in De Chongfu, and in Tianda you have that water acts as a mirror, the one Wu Zhi Jing, so the one who will kind of see
in
themselves
heaven.
in there.
And
so the connection between water and mirror, I think I didn't see in Ke Yi.
not in Ke Yi, no.
So there is a partial overlap, but the way it is developed, I think is slightly different.
I agree with you, but I think that's really interesting because the mirroring is a social outward act, and I think Ke Yi is really inward. Like that's why it cares about the composition of the water, whether it's clear, how it's moving. It does not care about what's going outward. So I think
so they have a different purpose in when they start to write. They have a different purpose of what they want to write, and they pick on different features of the same metaphor.
So it's a really common metaphor. Obviously, it's like water, like qiu shui is like it's all over, right? But there's something about the language that feels like there's a little relatedness. But I'm very on shaky ground there. We can't see the chat, so. Oh, there's a hand. Yeah.
No, just why did she just chat? Whether Brooke has a question. I mean, because I don't have my mic, so.
Well, let me do Frank's question first. It has been waiting.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but and they those connect to things people have been saying. It seems like if that Gu Yue is a kind of citation of something, then we really have to think how that relates to Zhuangzi, right? Given the way that's, it says Zhuangzi Yue, right? The Tiandao version, and then has Gu Yue that could be part of Zhuangzi quotation, but I think probably is not.
Yeah.
Right, and then, I guess I'm skeptical of the Gu Yue as a citation, but if so, it would seem like it would be citing Zhuangzi. Right. If it starts off Zhuangzi Yue and then the next one says Gu Yue, it would be therefore he also says this.
in Tiandao, not Ke Yi.
In Tiandao, right? But if we're taking that as similar between the two, I think it could be way too speculative. But that the lost material could be like a Zhuangzi material.
This is actually where I was going with it, and it will make people very mad. But I'm just maybe the real Zhuangzis in these crappy chapters. Like the traces of the real Zhuangzi are here. No.
But the bigger, I have a bunch of questions. I'll ask the bigger question. So I take all this whole set of chapters that we're looking at now as trying to give a kind of more active version of Wu Wei, right? Overall, that seems like one of the things. So they're all holding to the language of Wu Wei, but they're trying to say, but that means you could still do a lot, and it'd be Wu Wei. And so then it's interesting that both versions of these pieces move it that direction in different passages. So I read the water metaphor in the Ke Yi chapter differently from you, as saying, stillness is right, but you need to be active. Right. So metaphorically, it's criticizing the idea that no, you just still, you reflect things, and it's no, that's bad too.
Oh, stillness is bad.
Yeah, you can't just have stillness. You need to have action as well.
Oh, right. You can't just have stillness. But in Tiandao, it says Jing Ze Dong, which I found very odd.
Right. So at first I thought, well, the Ke Yi is taking the Tiandao material and trying to correct it and say, don't make it sound like this means you need to go off into the mountains and do nothing. This is compatible with being highly involved with things. But then the other one, it's the opposite direction. The Tiandao one is adding in the movement from the Ke Yi passage that doesn't have it, right? When it says the Jing leads, there's a few steps, but it's Shu to Jing to Dong to De, right, to attaining.
Well, the Ke Yi passage has it too, though, because it says if water is stagnant and doesn't flow, it won't be pure. And implication is you want it to be pure.
Right, but I'm saying these are in different, so in one passage,
yeah.
the Ke brings in more dong
Yeah.
than the Tiandao chapter.
Yeah.
But in another passage, the Tiandao chapter brings in more dong than the Ke chapter. So that's interesting that maybe they're both
both
correcting
pro-dong.
a source material that's they think is too still, maybe. And so they're repeating something that's not including enough movement, and then they're adding movement into it, but in actually different passages from each other. I don't know. It's-
Or the source material has the movement too, because like if we take the overlap as a sign of source material, I mean, I don't really care about composition so much, but if we do take it that way, if we take the overlap as a sign of source material, then it does have like Sheng Ye Tianxing. So his life is like this going of heaven, right?
Yeah.
And so there is movement.
Right.
It's like a natural movement, just not a forced movement. And so I kind of feel like that's, if there's I think there might be an over stillness, like a misunderstanding of Wu Wei, that there are other traces of it in Qi Wulun. There's one. It's like the sage does nothing. Is that right? And he says, no, that's not right. You're confused, right? So there's like a little bit of it there's some kind of tendency to misinterpret Wu Wei. But I don't necessarily think it's in the source material. It's like maybe just what they're writing against. But that would just be again, we're pretty speculative about the source material.
But if we take the shorter version as the closer to the source material version, then that would suggest at least two places where these are changing that source material to add more movement. Right.
Okay.
But it could still be that the original was also pro-movement, and they're just trying to like make it more consistent, push it more that direction.
Yeah.
You know.
Just to quickly add to Frank's first point before I pass the mic over, the Zhuangzi Yue quote comes before all four Gu Yue quotes in Tiandao, so it makes a lot of sense to say that all of them are referring back to Zhuangzi Yue as the source.
In Tiandao? Yeah. I didn't trace, because I didn't check Tiandao carefully, right? It's like, yeah, that's interesting.
I think we've got a line.
Okay.
I think it's Erica. I think the order is Erica, Tobias, and then Mark. That was the order. And then Brooke, you also have your hand up. Sorry. What is the order then? When did you raise your hand up, Brooke?
It's okay, don't worry about it.
Sorry, I'm last. I just can't figure out how to do the cartoon hand at the moment.
It's under reactions.
It's under reactions. That's okay. I have ceded my panel chair duties to Sonia, so Sonia, just pick somebody. It's okay.
Erica, may I pick on you first, and then just.
Hi, sure. I just have something very quick to add. I really, really appreciated Esther's analysis today and showing especially the parallels between the two chapters. And it was shocking to me because I was reminded of the kind of different version chapters and parallel chapters in the Moists, and thinking a lot about how these kinds of variations on a theme can occur. And it occurred to me that it almost seems like it's demonstrative proof of a kind of school, or a kind of at least a coalition of scholars who are coming together, and maybe they are assigned, even students perhaps assigned a theme to write about and to respond almost in a not a verbatim fashion, but in terms of topic. You've got the water, you've got the this, and you got to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to make that comment and bring that in as food for thought.
That's really, the parallel with Mois is really interesting. I hadn't thought of it, but once you say it, it feels productive.
Feels very similar, actually, because if you analyze some of the differences between the chapters, they really go off in different, and sometimes in very different ways.
But then it drags
but it's
back
almost
to
as if
something
they've been
similar.
given a prompt, and they're responding. So that's just my 2 cents right now.
Thank you so much. That's a really constructive kind of good thought to have. I will ponder it some more.
Apparently, Brooke had his actual hand up earlier than the yellow hands. Brooke, if you are there, would you mind going now? Asking your question?
Okay, yeah, sure. Just two quick thoughts. One is about the point Vim raised about the Zhuangzi water metaphor, and there's two of them. They're both about Ping, right? There's one in the horsehead humpback story too, right? At the end when Confucius is speaking. And I agree with Vim that in that case they are very much about, they're offered as explanations of why this person who makes no contribution and is so hideously ugly seems to attract people in this way, right? So it's all about this interpersonal, solving this interpersonal mystery of a kind of effectivity that comes from being sort of still and empty and all that good stuff. I'm not sure that I would read the one in Tian Dao that way, though, because that one also seems more inward to me. 圣人之心近乎天地之间也，万物之境也. So it's 天地之间. The sage, the mind of the sage, right, is the topic there, which is compared to water, which seems to me is saying it reflects, sort of from the subjective side, all of heaven and earth, and is the mirror of the 10,000 things, rather than maybe that the 10,000 things are drawn to it. So I would just query that one and see what the rest of you think. So I do think that is a repurposing of that metaphor in quite a different direction. However, going to Frank's point about the combination of motion and stillness, I agree that seems to be a recurring motif, and I felt the same way, that this is an attempted correction or a remedial action to pump up a certain aspect that the claim is being made that also pertains to all that wu-wei type stuff, stillness, tranquility, and
anti-quietist.
I wonder if that's also the question that Esther brought up about the very end of the chapter, the sword metaphor, right? Which seemed to have this weird tension. You got to store your sword away in the box, and then the first thing it says about it is it's flowing all over the place. It penetrates heaven and earth, right? It's sort of in this sort of constant effectivity outward, and even motion and flow. Yeah. So
I almost thought the sword metaphor was a negative, a negative example, but I'm not sure. Like don't be like the sword. Make your chi everywhere.
Oh, see, I was taking it the other way, which is to say, just like the sword, you preserve it. It's precious, and that's why it can function so great when you have to.
Or when you have to do it. Oh, so that fits the burnout metaphor, right?
because then it follows it up again with shou shen and all that kind of language, right? Holding on to, protecting, So there's some image there of like precisely by digging down deep and keeping it sort of rooted in this stillness, it gets this effectivity outward. Seems like it's constructed a little differently than the De Chongfu, which is so explicitly kind of intersubjective and social. But nevertheless, like it's sort of that's sort of the way people. I don't buy this myself, but a lot of people read the Kunpeng story that way too, right? There's a long tradition of that. Like you gotta dig deep and go down into the depths where the hidden is, and that's why you can fly up so high and so on. It's one of those.
But you don't read it that way.
I don't see that. I think that's a later motif, but maybe something like that is starting to take shape in these chapters. So
I'm intrigued by that suggestion. Like I had not thought of it that way, but if you use it that way, it ties in with the resting stuff, and that does kind of solve a problem that I also had, which was why a sword? Because all the other instances of hiding it in a box are jade. Or like it's not like sword is the distinctive thing about that particular use of the hiding in the box metaphor. But maybe it's because you got to use the sword. Like a jade is like an sword. You're gonna like go all over and like stab people with it. I don't know.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a textual variant there because it says ganyue, so it's like it's unclear that it's. There's some people who don't even think it's a sword, but yeah. What's the name of the sword?
Tobias and then Mark, if you don't mind. I saw his hand up before the other yellow hand. Tobias, would you mind asking your question?
Yeah, sure. Just one quick thought before I go to that. So, do we actually know whether the sword and sheath narrative was also sexual and gendered in early China by any chance? You know, because we talk a lot about Jingshen, right? And those kind of
Oh yeah, I mean, we made a lot
juices.
of hay with that, right? Because if you use your jing too much and don't stop, you know, you dry up.
So, you know, I
It
mean,
really
I don't know
says
whether
that. So.
I never looked into that, whether the sword image has that connotation oftentimes. I mean,
Keep your
or
sword
at
in
least a
that
general
box.
connotation. I would not be surprised if perhaps there is something to be found in that case. I mean, I have two things that I wanted to say. So one is at first about the intertextual thing with between the Huanans and the Ke. One quick add on, because originally I actually suggested that I would give the presentation on the Ke, and then
I see.
especially
That's
about the
why.
Huanan and the Ke, and because I had done more in that regard before I did stuff in the Tiandi. And I mean, one thing which is really interesting, right, is that most of the references most of the parallels, not references, right, show up in the Jingshan chapter.
Yeah, I noticed that.
So clearly, if that text existed, there was something very enticing about this idea of not burning yourself out and the physiological narrative that is basically, I think, pushed forward in the middle part of the Ke chapter.
Yeah.
That there seems to be something going on. And just to follow along with that kind of narrative, because you said earlier, what shall we do with Shen in these cases? And I do think, I never understand why Jingshan is translated as a compound, as quintessential spirits, when it, in my opinion, at least in the Han Dynasty at some point, clearly refers back to a yin and yang portion of bodily spirits,
Jing and
essences,
Shen.
or whatever you want to call them, right? But Jing is semen or at these essences, right, that are associated with liquidy stuff, and because of that with Di. And then Shen, right, is something that is more airy in many forms and is associated with Yang. And I'm just wondering, whether we find something like an early stratum, perhaps, of that kind of vision already popping up here in the Ke chapter, because it really uses Jingshan, right, as kind of as a term itself, but also just as a thing. So we deal with physiological terminologies, I think, rather than like saying spirit or demon, that remain at the end of the day very, in this kind of binary between spirit and body that we oftentimes still utilize, right? And that other people that are not here in this group have made big shtick out of, right? Entire books written about these things. Where, when you look at it, it sounds to me like the singular is almost always wrong. And the dichotomy is just tricky, right? That we just project in these moments into terms like Shen.
That's interesting and helpful, and I just didn't know what to do. Like, I find Shen especially difficult of translation. The only thing I want to let other people ask questions, but the only comment I have sort of to make about that is I do not think Jing and Shen, I don't think Jing Shen shows up as a term. I think it happens to be together in their Jing and Shen because they're so separable in Ke. Like in Ke, they're used separately, Jing and Shen. So I think when you see Jing Shen, it's Jing and Shen, probably. If I mistranslated that, I didn't mean to, because it's like, I think it's two things.
I think it's almost always an early text, I would say, Jing and Shen. It's never Jing Shen.
Yeah, no, exactly. But you said it shows up as a term.
What I mean is like, there are two entities. And if you think about it, like at least in later Taoist movements, right, you transform your Jing into Shen by doing reversed ejaculation practices and stuff like that, right? So I mean, there at least some of these ideas are still around, right? That Jing and Shen are two entities that can basically be transformed from one thing into another. We don't know what those were all there in the early part, right? But I do think that framework probably is more fruitful than just talking about some kind of mysterious spirits that nobody knows what to do with.
That's a good comment. Thanks.
It is Mark, and then a student has a question, and then Chris, if Chris doesn't mind waiting a bit.
So I wanted to change a little bit to the beginning, just because since we did Tian Xia, I think we're really interested in these types of taxonomies. And I guess I think I never look closely at this either, but it's so similar to Samatan, right? One thing you're lacking, though, is this kind of narrative of decline and fragmentation of the Tao. It's more like, there are these different approaches, and then there's this one culminating approach, right? In a way. And I was just thinking that actually, you know, Samatan does that, this does that. And I was thinking about your comments about them all having the same number. And I was thinking, when we were talking about Tianxia, though, we were pretty suspicious about the Hui Shi at the end, right? About whether that's tacked on, just because structurally it's so dissimilar from the other ones, right? So, but I was thinking about 5s and 6s, and it made me think of there's this other, the Wu Xing has the 4 mentioned virtues that culminate in sagacity, and it's one of those rare kind of Confucian texts that has that similar structural approach. And then in the Han, what happens is Jia Yi takes those 5 and adds a 6th one. So it is kind of interesting whether you've got the 5 or the 6. I wonder if there's a kind of, I mean, it strikes me as a particularly Han move to going back to all we were talking about what's distinctive about the Han, to take these different things and then synthesize them through one kind of culminating kind of universal approach in a way. And that's definitely what Jia Yi does in that case. And you wonder if that's, you know, both Samatan and this then would be examples of a kind of, but anyway, no, I think that's really, it's fascinating. After doing Qiandao last time, doing this, you must have been like...
Yeah, you're right. Hui Shi, if I count Hui Shi, it does kind of like, it makes 6, but maybe that's a bit wrong. But
yeah, or maybe it was added to make it conform to the Han number, right?
Now, canon people talk about the motion from 6ity to 5ness in the Han, because you went from Liu Yi to Wu Jing. So Henderson talks about that.
But that's a list rather than a culminating one, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and I think the other, like the lists of the decline, like in Han Feizi, when you talk about the fragmentation of the Confucian school or things like that, or Xunzi, those are all like just dividing up into kind of equal kind of streams.
Yeah.
But it's really this, what's distinctive about this and Samatan is that the last category is the one that embraces all. That's true. So that would be a
Interesting. That's a good comment though. I probably muddled those. I conflated the ones that are just a list with the ones that are the culminating one, and maybe I should attend more to the culmination structure. I think that's probably right.
Well, and that might be the Han twist.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, so we don't have much time. So the question by Maiko has been sitting there for a while.
Okay.
Maybe we can like just read that and then go to Chris's question. Would you like me to read it, or would you like to just read it yourself?
I can read it if you want. So, oh no, you read it. It's very awkward for me to read it.
I don't pretend to be her.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for a intriguing lecture. I am Maiko, a grad student from SMAU. I actually researched
wonderful.
the metaphor of water in Lao Tzu when I was an undergrad. Lao Tzu's water metaphor is influenced by Huainanzi, Yuan Daxun, Tian Wanxun in some points. Huainanzi have things in common with Tai Yi, Shangshui, more specifically. Anyway, that also emphasizes the way of ideal ruler to express Wu Wei by using the motor metaphor. I feel the message of Zhuangzi's water metaphor is stronger than that of Lao Tzu because it is more emphasize clearness and flatness by showing the nature of water and the motion of heaven, as you mentioned. Then my question is, what is the peculiarity of Zhuangzi's water metaphor distinguished from other textbooks like Lao Tzu? For example, the variety of messages, as you mentioned, the difference between the meaning in Tiandao, Pian, and Keyi Pian.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I do think the Lao Tzu Shangshan Roshui kind of background of it must somewhat inform some of these at least, and I think unfortunately we didn't come to your question earlier. I know this question came at 10:12. So, and in some ways we've answered it a little bit because there is clearly a variety. The water metaphor is being used inconsistently, I think, to mean different things. The mirror motif, which doesn't show up in Keyi, but clearly shows up several times in different chapters, is one of them that I don't think you get in Lao-Tzu, do you? I don't know Lao-Tzu that well, but like, I don't think, I mean, you could probably tell me, but since you've researched it in Lao-Tzu. But yeah, and the Huainanzi use of water, I don't know very well either, but you should chat to Tobias, who's a Huainanzi expert, and you're like both online, so do a chat and see. But yeah, no, it is interesting, but it's very common metaphor through what I take to be the time period, because when they're talking about Xing, the Mengzi like use of the water metaphor and Gaozi use of water metaphor, and so water is like associated with Xing discourse a little bit, maybe. I'm not sure, but I would kind of take that to be related as well.
Chris has been waiting forever, so maybe
last one. And
Okay, a couple of comments. One is I wanted to second Brooks' remark that the use of some of the stillness and water imagery in Tiandao is a little bit different from in the Zhongfu. Particularly, it seems to be expressing a conception of ideal agency, whereas as Brooke was saying in the Zhongfu, there's this social aspect of it. So that's one point. And then another is, unsurprisingly, I don't read Keyi as a single pericope. I think it's 3.
Right. No, I think so too.
Yeah, and when you put it up on screen from Donald Sturgeon's website, and the second part just divides it into all those guyue, it just looks like a notebook that somebody has collected a number of points. And what I'd like to point out, this is my substantive comment, is that the guyue bits in that second section are actually kind of miscellaneous. They don't all agree with each other. In particular, the one in the middle about 圣人之生也天行 is kind of on a different topic than some of the other ones. This one emphasizes more a mode of agency that involves wholly giving yourself up to, as it says at the end, 和天德. And I'm curious, maybe Tobias might know more about this. So this section it shares material. I don't know what direction the quotation is going. It shares material with at least Huainanzi 1 and 7, primarily Jingshan, but also
can
1.
I have my slides back?
And the shared material that I noted in a previous project mostly had to do with internal equanimity and control of emotions, basically.
Yeah.
And then there's that middle bit that says eliminate knowing and reasons, and in effect, just give up what we think of as normal human agency. And that shares material with Zhuangzi 36, with Xin Shu. So I just wanted to sort of point out that, that collection of quotes isn't even on the same subject, as it were. And that middle bit, which does get quoted in Tiandao, is on a slightly different subject, and it's much more extreme. It's really quite radical than some of the other material.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, you so I was kind of responding to your contention earlier that the middle pericope of Keyi is miscellaneous and grab bag, and it's like somebody's scrap notebook. You said this in your talk, right? And I was pondering whether I think that's true, and I don't think it's entirely true, although I do acknowledge the heterogeneity that you're talking about. Like, I don't think it's that sloppy. Like, it's a crap chapter, but it's not that crap, right? So I do think that the author may not be very skillful in tying these things together, but he's trying. And kind of Brooks' reading of the sword and the box metaphor may help me at least to tie together the burnout stuff with the end stuff. But also, I think some of the middle part, which I sort of can't quite, because I don't have the slides back, but the sort of middle part where the part you said is very radical and overlaps with Tiandao, that's really, really poetic in feel, and I think it holds together aesthetically rather than philosophically more, but it does have the kind of life and death stuff, that sort of middle section of 2. And then it goes into the water metaphor, and then it goes into the emotion stuff. And so I feel like the emotion part of it is meant to follow from the water metaphor, or it's the other way around. I can't remember. I think the emotion part of it follows from the water metaphor. And so you have this kind of stillness and motion, but basically it's very negative on emotions, right? I didn't talk about it because I thought there wouldn't be time. I'm just going to look at it now. Sorry, the emotion part is first, and the water metaphor ends.
So the emotion stuff also connects up with, I'm sorry, I think of all the passages as numbers rather than titles now. So 23.7, is that Shu Wu Gui? Has a passage that also shares language with this. Yeah, Gengshang Chu. Okay, so that has a passage that shares language with this also, with or has similar language where it says that the emotions are like blockages or diseases of virtue.
Yeah, and here I don't think it's interesting to try to think about what metaphors, how the emotions are fitting in. My note on it is like pure pathologizing of emotions, right? So like emotions are all mistakes, which is a little bit surprising given the kind of motion. It's an English problem, but like motion dong is good, but like emotions are sort of uncontrolled motions, kind of something like that. And so all of them are seen as bad, but they're not mistakes of blockage. They're mistakes of movement, right? So in
this case, yeah.
Yeah, she knew is dao zhi guo. It's like overstep. And
so they contrast with the stillness. And so presumably there's a water metaphor standing behind that stuff with the emotions.
I wonder. I think maybe so. Yeah.
Well, insofar as there are disturbances is in the qi, and qi itself is water vapor.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess what I'm saying is they all do have intertextual relationships, and so therefore you get the sense that Kuyi writer is not much of a writer, and is like pulling stuff together, but he's trying to like fit them, connect them. Yeah. I think so.
Well, the interconnections of that central section are just amazing. It's tied to so many other texts.
Yeah.
But so it's also tied to Zhuangzi.
Yeah, but it's tissue of quotations style composition.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think it is composition. Like it is being composed. It's not somebody's notebook. I think that would be my contention. It's an essay. It's just an essay that's not very original.
But so is it an essay that's being quoted in Zhuangzi?
No, isn't it?
I mean, that's where I think
Zhuangzi
Scott
earlier?
said maybe there's some other source out
Zhuangzi
there.
later?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know Zhuangzi very well.
So Zhuangzi 36 Xin Shu shares language with that middle section.
Us, yeah. I guess my assumption was. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they're both quoting source text.
I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm
Yeah.
just saying this is one of the most puzzling and intriguing samples we have of this sort of bricolage and intertextual connections and all that. And I don't know how we're ever going to figure it out, but it's. Yeah.
Tobias's Huainanzi thing yesterday, where he showed the Huainanzi passage, and then look, it's like 10 different chapters from, what we call chapters from Zhuangzi, all kind of squished together. And like it's visually very impressive, right? Shiji does this with Lunyu. So Shiji Boyi Lie Zhuan has that relationship with Lunyu. There's a passage where it's just like, it's always punctuated now with the Lunyu punctuation. It's just punctuation showing the Lunyu quotes as quotes. But obviously in the original, it's not going to be like that. It feels like Lunyu he's just using Lunyu language and that's coming out of him, right? It's like playing music. It's like you're playing the Lunyu music, the Lunyu theme, because that's what's appropriate for that moment. And I just wonder if that's that kind of bricolage composition is like, that's what you're doing. You're playing the theme from that. That's because I've been reading Zhang Xuecheng's Yan Gong. So like words belong to everybody, right? We're like obsessively cutting them up into different texts. But at this time, according to Zhang Xuecheng, words are communal, right? They're just communal property. You just grab them when you need them.
Thanks, Esther. Just in case anybody was wondering, I pasted the Zhuangzi bit into the chat.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, but thanks a lot for your presentation.
Oh, yeah, thanks for your comments. I really appreciate it. And like, I think you probably found more intertextual connections than I did because I was doing it on a plane.
A very tough presentation to follow because it was so rich. So we are actually out of time. We are supposed to give a break now and then come back at 11. Thank you so much, Esther, for this really great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all.